Hey guys, tonight we're taking a journey back in time to an era of knights, castles, and some truly questionable personal hygiene, the medieval age. But instead of focusing on epic battles or grand feasts, we're going to dive into the quiet, often terrifying, and surprisingly grim reality of a niche, yet strangely popular profession, the miserable life of a medieval hermit. Boring history for sleep. Forget your cozy bed and your reliable Wi Fi. Imagine stepping into a damp, isolated cave with only stale bread and your own thoughts for company. Knowing that your days will be spent battling hunger, the elements, and perhaps your own sanity, all for the sake of spiritual purity. Sounds like a tough gig? Right! Being a medieval hermit was indeed a brutal, pervasive reality for thousands. But here's the cheeky reality check if you were one. You probably wouldn't survive to a ripe old age. At least, not without some serious hallucinations, frostbite, and a constant craving for actual human conversation. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Also, let me know where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you right now. Now, dim the lights. Maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum. And let's ease into tonight's journey together. Your journey into the brutal world of a medieval hermit begins with the most fundamental, and often soul-crushing, aspect of your chosen path: extreme isolation solitude, loneliness, mental toll. Forget casual chats and comforting companionship in your chosen spiritual retreat. Your very existence was a constant, profound struggle against the absence of human connection, making every passing day a deeper descent into the quiet, often terrifying, depths of your own mind. Imagine the deafening silence of the wilderness, broken only by the rustling of leaves or the hoot of an owl, and the palpable ache in your chest that came from days, weeks, or even months without a single human voice. This was the omnipresent reality of your extreme isolation. You had voluntarily renounced society, family, and companionship in pursuit of spiritual purity and a closer connection to the divine. This meant choosing a life of solitude, deliberately removing yourself from all forms of human interaction. You were not just a holy person, you were a living experiment in human endurance, pushing the boundaries of what the psyche could withstand without the bedrock of social interaction. It's like being a modern-day astronaut on a solo mission to Mars. But your space capsule is a damp cave, and your mission control is just your own conscience. The initial appeal of solitude might have been spiritual clarity, a respite from worldly temptations and distractions. But as the days bled into weeks, the profound loneliness would begin to set in. You'd yearn for a friendly face, a shared laugh, or even just the simple comfort of another person's presence. Imagine the conversations you'd have with yourself, the echoes of memories, or the way you'd meticulously observe a passing squirrel, craving any form of connection to another living being. This wasn't merely quiet time, it was an active deprivation of one of humanity's most fundamental needs, a constant, gnawing void that few are truly equipped to handle. This extreme lack of social interaction inevitably led to a severe mental toll, without external stimulation or the tempering influence of others. Your thoughts could become repetitive, obsessive, or even distorted. Delusions, hallucinations, or a slow descent into despair were not uncommon for those who push the boundaries of such profound isolation. Imagine the whispers in the wind taking on human voices, the shadows dancing in your peripheral vision becoming unsettling figures, or the creeping sensation that your grip on reality was slowly loosening. It's enough to make you wish for a simple life as a peasant, or perhaps just a very reliable medieval therapist. This self-imposed extreme isolation highlights the brutal psychological cost of the hermit's spiritual quest, demonstrating that while the pursuit of piety was noble, The human mind was often ill-equipped to handle the profound deprivation of social contact, leading to severe mental and emotional distress. One mainstream historical fact that powerfully illustrates this psychological impact is the accounts from early Christian desert fathers and later medieval hermits themselves, who frequently described intense spiritual battles, visions, and encounters with demons often interpreted by modern scholars as symptoms of prolonged isolation, sensory deprivation, and malnutrition. A particularly quirky or fringe tidbit is that some medieval hermits, in an attempt to alleviate their profound loneliness, would reportedly befriend local wild animals, even going so far as to give them names and share their meager rations. Believing these creatures were sent by God or were perhaps even manifestations of angels or demons. Imagine having a pet badger as your only confidant. It certainly highlights their desperate attempts to find connection in extreme solitude. Historians still argue whether the extreme isolation chosen by medieval hermits primarily fostered genuine spiritual enlightenment and a deeper connection to God, as they transcended worldly distractions, or if it more often led to profound psychological distress and mental instability, demonstrating the fundamental human need for social interaction. Did it bring them closer to God, or just push them to the brink? Regardless, your medieval life as a hermit began and was perpetually defined by extreme isolation, enduring profound solitude, debilitating loneliness, and a severe mental toll. So, your medieval life as a hermit began and was perpetually defined by extreme isolation, enduring profound solitude, debilitating loneliness, and a severe mental toll. But even if your mind could somehow withstand the crushing weight of isolation, your body faced a more immediate, tangible, and often brutal threat: primitive shelter cold, damp, wild animals. Forget cozy stone cottages and sturdy walls in your chosen wilderness retreat. Your dwelling was often little more than a flimsy barrier against the relentless elements and the lurking dangers of the untamed world, making every night a gamble with exposure and predation. Imagine the biting chills seeping into your bones from the damp earth, the constant drip of water from the cavern ceiling, and the rustling sounds outside your flimsy hovel, hinting at unseen beasts. This was the omnipresent reality of your primitive shelter. Whether you lived in a shallow cave, a crudely built hut, or even just a hollowed-out tree, your dwelling offered minimal protection from the harsh realities of nature. It was often intended to be a place for contemplation, not comfort, and certainly not a fortress. You were not just a holy person, you were a perpetually shivering, damp inhabitant of the wilderness, constantly battling the elements just to survive another night. It's like being a modern-day extreme survivalist, but your gear is mostly natural debris, and your goal is spiritual enlightenment, not just making it to morning. Your shelter was inevitably cold for much of the year. Medieval Europe, even in its milder regions, experienced significant temperature drops, especially at night and during winter. Your thin walls or rocky confines offered little insulation against the biting winds and freezing temperatures. Imagine huddling in a fetal position, shivering uncontrollably, feeling the icy air seeping through every crack, desperately trying to conserve your body heat with only meager clothing or perhaps a single rough blanket. The relentless cold would penetrate your muscles, making sleep a fitful, shallow affair. Equally pervasive was the damp. Whether it was rain seeping through a leaky roof, groundwater percolating up through the floor, or condensation forming on cold stone, moisture was your constant companion. This dampness exacerbated the cold and fostered mildew, making your meager possessions perpetually clammy and unpleasant. Imagine the smell of perpetually wet earth and mold, the clammy feel of your sleeping spot, and the way the moisture seemed to cling to everything, making your existence feel perpetually miserable. It's enough to make you wish for a simple thatched cottage, or perhaps just a very powerful medieval dehumidifier. And then there were the wild animals. Your isolated dwelling, by its very nature, was located in their territory. Wolves, bears, wild boar, and even smaller, but still dangerous. Creatures like venomous snakes or aggressive rodents were constant threats. Your flimsy shelter offered little more than a psychological deterrent. Imagine the spine-chilling sound of an unseen animal snuffling just outside your door, the frantic scrabbling of mice within your walls, or the sudden, terrifying realization that a large predator was too close for comfort, making every night a tense vigil against the unseen dangers of the wilderness. This reliance on primitive shelter highlights the extreme asceticism of the hermit's life, demonstrating their willingness to endure profound physical discomfort and constant danger for their spiritual quest, often pushing their bodies to the very limits of human endurance in their chosen solitude. One mainstream historical fact that powerfully illustrates these conditions is the archaeological excavations of historical hermitage sites, which often reveal extremely simple structures, sometimes just natural rock shelters or small, crudely built stone or timber huts, with minimal evidence of creature comforts, supporting accounts of their austere living conditions. A particularly quirky or fringe tidbit is that some medieval hermits, particularly those dwelling in caves, would reportedly attempt to domesticate small wild animals like birds or mice. Not just for companionship, remember that extreme isolation, but also to serve as an early warning system against larger predators. A kind of primitive furry doorbell. Imagine sharing your meager breadcrumbs with a field mouse, hoping it would squeak if a wolf approached. It certainly highlights their resourceful adaptation to their environment. Historians still argue whether the choice of primitive shelter by medieval hermits primarily reflected a genuine disdain for worldly comforts and a desire for profound spiritual purification, making their suffering a deliberate act of piety, or if it was also a practical necessity driven by a lack of resources and a deliberate removal from established human settlements and their amenities. Did it show profound faith? Or just practical limitations regardless? Your medieval life as a hermit was defined by your primitive shelter, enduring relentless cold, pervasive damp, and the constant threat of wild animals. So, your medieval life as a hermit was defined by your primitive shelter, enduring relentless cold, pervasive damp, and the constant threat of wild animals. But even if you managed to avoid freezing or being eaten, the next, and arguably most constant, torment was the relentless gnawing of your empty stomach scant diet foraging, hunger, malnutrition. Forget 3 square meals and dietary supplements in your chosen wilderness. Every calorie was hard-won, every morsel a testament to deprivation, making hunger not just an occasional discomfort, but a pervasive, body-altering reality. Imagine the dull ache in your belly that rarely subsided, the lightheadedness that came with prolonged fasting, and the way your body slowly wasted away, shedding muscle and fat. This was the omnipresent reality of your scant diet. Hermits deliberately embraced asceticism, a practice of severe self-discipline and abstinence, often including rigorous fasting and a minimal intake of food. This wasn't just about eating less, it was about consuming just enough to survive. And sometimes, not even that. You were not just a holy person, you were a living testament to deprivation, constantly pushing the limits of what the human body could endure without adequate sustenance. It's like being a modern-day extreme dieter, but your diet plan is dictated by an empty stomach, and your goal is spiritual enlightenment, not just fitting into smaller clothes. Your primary method of acquiring food was often foraging. This meant scouring the wilderness for whatever edible plants, berries, roots, or occasional insects you could find. There was no grocery store, no convenient farm. Every morsel was a treasure hunted in the wild. Imagine the painstaking search for a handful of wild berries. The careful identification of edible roots, one mistake could be fatal, or the grim necessity of collecting snails or grubs. Knowing that these meager findings were all that stood between you and complete starvation, your diet would be overwhelmingly plant-based, often monotonous and seasonal, fluctuating wildly with what nature provided. This constant foraging inevitably led to pervasive hunger, you'd rarely feel truly full. Your body would constantly be in a state of energy deficit, leading to weakness, fatigue, and a preoccupation with food that would dominate your waking thoughts. Imagine the intense cravings for hearty bread, roasted meat, or even just a warm bowl of gruel, as your body screamed for nourishment that simply wasn't available. This wasn't merely a rumble in your stomach, it was a deep, physical longing that colored every moment of your day. Over time, this scant diet would result in severe malnutrition. Your body would lack essential vitamins, minerals, and proteins, leading to a host of debilitating health issues. Your hair might thin, your skin would become sallow, your immune system would weaken, making you vulnerable to disease. A topic for another section, and your physical strength would diminish. Imagine the creeping weakness in your limbs, the constant susceptibility to illness, and the slow, inevitable decline of your physical health, a direct consequence of your spiritual devotion. It's enough to make you wish for a simple life as a farmer, or perhaps just a very reliable medieval MRE delivery service. This self-imposed scant diet highlights the extreme physical demands of the hermit's spiritual path, demonstrating their willingness to endure profound hunger and chronic malnutrition as a form of penance and a means to purify the soul, pushing their bodies to the brink of survival. One mainstream historical fact that powerfully illustrates these dietary extremes is the numerous hagiographies, saints' lives, and monastic rules from the medieval period that recount detailed descriptions of hermits' extremely sparse diets, often consisting of only bread, water, wild herbs, or dried fruits, explicitly emphasizing their fasting and ascetic practices as central to their piety. A particularly quirky or fringe tidbit is that some medieval hermits, particularly those who committed to truly extreme fasting, would reportedly hallucinate entire feasts or banquets laid out before them, complete with savory smells and rich flavors, a vivid manifestation of their desperate hunger, which they would often interpret as demonic temptations. Imagine dreaming of a roast chicken dinner so vividly you could almost taste it, only to wake up to another handful of tasteless berries. It certainly highlights the intense psychological impact of prolonged food deprivation. Historians still argue whether the extreme dietary asceticism of medieval hermits primarily allowed for a heightened spiritual awareness and visions, as the body's needs were suppressed, or if it more often led to severe physical deterioration, cognitive impairment, and psychological distress, undermining the very spiritual goals it sought to achieve. Did it bring spiritual clarity, or just physical misery regardless? Your medieval life as a hermit was a perpetual battle against a scant diet, ceaseless foraging, unrelenting hunger, and debilitating malnutrition. So, your medieval life as a hermit was a perpetual battle against a scant diet, ceaseless foraging, unrelenting hunger, and debilitating malnutrition. But the physical suffering didn't stop at just what you put into your body. Often, it extended to what you did to your body. In the name of piety, self-flagellation, penance, physical suffering, forget comfort and self-care. In your chosen path of spiritual devotion, inflicting pain upon yourself was often seen as a direct route to spiritual purification. Making your own flesh a canvas for your unwavering faith, imagine the sharp sting of a lash across your bare back, the dull throb of bruised skin after a night of kneeling on rough stones, or the constant ache in your limbs from deliberately uncomfortable postures. This was the omnipresent reality of self-flagellation. For many medieval hermits, the physical body was seen as a vessel for sin, a source of temptation, and a distraction from true spiritual focus. By inflicting pain and discomfort, they believed they could punish their earthly desires, emulate the suffering of Christ, and hasten their spiritual ascent. You were not just a holy person, you were your own tormentor, meticulously devising ways to make your physical existence as miserable as possible. It's like being a modern-day extreme athlete, but your training regimen involves deliberately hurting yourself, and your trophy is spiritual enlightenment. The most literal form of this was penance through self-inflicted pain. This could range from wearing rough hair shirts that constantly chafed your skin, to binding limbs with tight ropes, to even more extreme practices like deliberately staying awake for days, or exposing yourself to extreme cold. Remember that primitive shelter from Section 2. Imagine the relentless itch of a coarse garment against your skin, the pins and needles sensation of a limb going numb, or the shivering tremors that racked your body from prolonged exposure to the elements. All self-imposed in the name of spiritual discipline, but the most iconic, and perhaps brutal, form was literal self-flagellation. Hermits would use various instruments, often a small whip made of leather thongs, sometimes with knots or even embedded sharp objects, to strike their own backs or limbs. This was a direct, visceral act of atonement, a symbolic purging of sin. Imagine the sharp, searing pain as the leather bit into your flesh, the slow blooming of welts and bruises, and the feeling of blood trickling down your skin, all endured with grim determination. Believing each lash brought you closer to God, it's enough to make you wish for a simple life as a happy-go-lucky baker, or perhaps just a very comprehensive medieval pain management specialist. This practice of self-flagellation highlights the extreme asceticism and often brutal piety of medieval hermits, demonstrating a profound belief in the spiritual efficacy of physical suffering as a means to achieve purity, humility, and a deeper connection to the divine, even at immense personal cost. One mainstream historical fact that powerfully illustrates these practices is the numerous medieval hagiographies and monastic rules that explicitly describe and sometimes even prescribe various forms of physical penance, including wearing rough clothing. Prolonged fasting, remember that scant diet from Section 3, sleeping on hard surfaces, and self-scourging with whips. Confirming these practices were widespread and accepted within certain ascetic traditions. A particularly quirky or fringe tidbit is that some medieval hermits, particularly those committed to intense self-flagellation, would reportedly create a sacred spot in their hermitage where they would perform their penance, sometimes even marking the spot with carved crosses or symbols in the rock. Believing this made the act of suffering more potent and connected them directly to Christ's passion. Imagine having a designated suffering zone in your cave. It certainly highlights the ritualistic and deeply personal nature of their extreme devotion. Historians still argue whether the widespread practice of self-flagellation among medieval hermits primarily reflected a genuine theological conviction that physical suffering purifies the soul and brings one closer to God, or if it was also influenced by the psychological effects of extreme isolation and malnutrition, leading to distorted perceptions of reality and self-harming behaviors. Did it bring true piety, or just mental distress regardless? Your medieval life as a hermit often involved systematic self-flagellation, pursuing rigorous penance, and enduring profound physical suffering. So, your medieval life as a hermit often involved systematic self-flagellation, pursuing rigorous penance, and enduring profound physical suffering. But beyond the self-inflicted pain, a more pervasive and less intentional form of misery clung to your very being: lack of hygiene, filth, disease, parasites. Forget daily showers and sterile environments in your chosen wilderness retreat. Cleanliness was not just ignored, but actively eschewed as a worldly vanity, making your body a walking ecosystem of grime, illness, and unwelcome inhabitants. Imagine the pervasive odor that clung to your skin and clothing, the constant itch of unwashed hair, and the telltale signs of microscopic and not-so-microscopic creatures making your body their home. This was the omnipresent reality of your lack of hygiene. For many medieval hermits, personal cleanliness was seen as a luxury, a distraction, or even a sinful indulgence that pulled one away from spiritual contemplation. Renouncing baths, washing, and even changing clothes was a common form of asceticism. Designed to humble the body and focus the mind on higher matters, you were not just a holy person, you were a walking biohazard, a living testament to the medieval understanding of cleanliness or lack thereof. It's like being a modern-day performance artist. But your art is simply living in a perpetual state of medieval squalor, and your audience is mostly just the local fleas. The inevitable consequence was pervasive filth. Your hair would become matted, your skin coated with layers of dirt, sweat, and grime, and your meager clothing would be perpetually soiled and likely stiff with accumulated muck. Imagine the feeling of dirt caked under your fingernails, the greasy stickiness of your hair, and the way the pervasive odor seemed to follow you everywhere, a constant reminder of your deliberate uncleanliness. This wasn't merely being a little dirty, it was a profound, multi-sensory immersion in your own bodily effluvia and environmental grime. This rampant uncleanliness created ideal breeding grounds for disease and parasites. Without regular washing, your skin was vulnerable to infections, sores, and rashes. The accumulation of waste and lack of sanitation in and around your primitive shelter, remember that from Section 2 created fertile ground for bacteria and viruses? And then there were the uninvited guest fleas, lice, and body mites would thrive in your unwashed hair and clothing, leading to constant itching and discomfort. Imagine the relentless scratching, the inflamed bites on your skin, and the terrifying knowledge that a simple scratch could turn into a festering wound. With no medical care available, we'll get to that. It's enough to make you wish for a simple life as a cleaner, or perhaps just a very enthusiastic medieval delousing service. This deliberate lack of hygiene highlights the extreme asceticism and often counterproductive practices of medieval hermits, demonstrating a profound spiritual commitment that ironically led to severe physical degradation and made them uniquely vulnerable to the myriad of health scourges that plagued the medieval world. One mainstream historical fact that powerfully illustrates this lack of hygiene is the accounts within hagiographies and monastic rules which often praise hermits for their deliberate avoidance of bathing and personal grooming, sometimes even mentioning the accumulation of dirt and the presence of vermin as signs of their extreme piety and detachment from worldly comforts. A particularly quirky or fringe tidbit is that some medieval hermits, particularly those who were particularly infested with lice, would reportedly attempt to count the number of lice on their bodies as a form of living rosary or a spiritual exercise in humility and patience. Believing each louse represented a sin being cleansed or a small martyrdom endured, imagine trying to use your head lice as a spiritual counting tool. It certainly highlights their extreme psychological and spiritual reinterpretation of their miserable physical reality. Historians still argue whether the deliberate lack of hygiene among medieval hermits primarily reflected a profound spiritual conviction that external purity was irrelevant compared to internal purity, demonstrating a genuine theological stance, or if it was also a reflection of the general medieval understanding of disease and sanitation, which was rudimentary even in urban areas, making their chosen lifestyle simply an extreme version of common practice. Did it show deeper faith? Or just common ignorance regardless? Your medieval life as a hermit was defined by a profound lack of hygiene, enduring pervasive filth, constant disease, and relentless parasites. So, your medieval life as a hermit was defined by a profound lack of hygiene, enduring pervasive filth, constant disease, and relentless parasites. But even if your own body wasn't actively attacking you, the world outside your primitive shelter, remember that from Section 2 was a constant, relentless adversary exposure to elements weather, unprotected vulnerability, forget climate-controlled environments and protective gear in your chosen wilderness. You were perpetually at the mercy of nature's raw power, making every change in the sky a direct threat to your meager existence. Imagine the biting wind whipping through your tattered robes, the relentless downpour soaking you to the bone, or the scorching sun beating down on your unprotected head. This was the omnipresent reality of your exposure to elements. Your chosen path of solitude meant living directly within nature, with minimal barriers between your fragile human form and the unbridled forces of the weather. You didn't just observe the weather, you lived it, in its most extreme and unforgiving forms. You were not just a holy person, you were a human weather vane, constantly being battered by the very air you breathed. It's like being a modern-day extreme meteorologist, but your forecast is just whatever hits you, and your equipment is basically a prayer and a thin tunic. The relentless weather cycles were your constant companion, and often your tormentor. Winter brought freezing temperatures, snow, and icy winds that threatened frostbite and hypothermia. Remember that cold from Section 2. Spring and autumn brought relentless rains that turned your dwelling into a damp, miserable haven. Remember that damp. Summer, while perhaps offering some respite, could bring scorching heat waves. Dehydration, especially with that scant diet from Section 3, and fierce thunderstorms. Imagine the desperate search for even a sliver of dry ground after a deluge, the shivering tremors that racked your body in a sudden cold snap, or the parched throat and dizzy spells from days under a merciless sun, all endured with no real escape. Your unprotected vulnerability was profound. You deliberately eschewed comforts, meaning you often had only thin, worn clothing, no proper footwear, and certainly no advanced survival gear. Your body was your only defense. Imagine the raw chafing of wind-burnt skin, the cracked and bleeding feet from constant exposure to rough terrain and moisture, and the sensation of water seeping into every crevice, chilling you to the bone. You had no sturdy roof that wouldn't leak, no thick walls that truly insulated, and no proper fire to keep you truly warm, as that would require effort. And perhaps worldly comfort. It's enough to make you wish for a simple life as a sheltered monk, or perhaps just a very reliable medieval waterproof poncho. This constant exposure to elements highlights the profound physical suffering deliberately embraced by medieval hermits, demonstrating their unwavering commitment to asceticism and their willingness to push the human body to its absolute limits in pursuit of spiritual purity. Often viewing the harshness of nature as another form of divine test or penance, one mainstream historical fact that powerfully illustrates this vulnerability is the numerous medieval hagiographies that recount instances of hermits enduring extreme weather conditions, such as blizzards, floods, and droughts, often miraculously surviving them as proof of their divine favor, which inherently acknowledges the pervasive danger these elements pose to their lives. A particularly quirky or fringe tidbit is that some medieval hermits, in an attempt to protect themselves from particularly harsh winds, would reportedly build small, crude wind shelters out of interwoven branches and leaves. Not necessarily for warmth, but just to break the direct force of the gales, believing that enduring the cold was spiritual, but being battered by wind was merely annoying. Imagine building a little leafy shield just to stop the wind from literally blowing you away. It certainly highlights their practical adaptation within their chosen austere lifestyle. Historians still argue whether the extreme exposure to the elements endured by medieval hermits primarily hastened their physical decline and shortened their lifespans, making their spiritual journey a literal martyrdom of the body, or if the constant physiological stress, combined with their spiritual focus, led to a unique form of physical and mental hardiness that allowed them to withstand conditions that would kill an ordinary person. Did it break them down, or harden them regardless? Your medieval life as a hermit was a relentless battle against exposure to elements, enduring brutal weather, and living in perpetual unprotected vulnerability. So, your medieval life as a hermit was a relentless battle against exposure to elements, enduring brutal weather, and living in perpetual unprotected vulnerability. But even if your body could somehow withstand the physical torments, your mind, stripped bare by isolation and deprivation, often faced an even more terrifying battle: spiritual warfare temptations, demonic visions. Forget peaceful contemplation in your chosen solitude. The absence of worldly distractions often gave rise to an intense inner conflict, making your mind a battleground for your soul against unseen, malevolent forces. Imagine the sudden, unbidden surge of forbidden desires, the whispering voices in the stillness of your cave urging you to abandon your vows, or the terrifying appearance of grotesque figures in your peripheral vision. This was the omnipresent reality of your spiritual warfare. Medieval belief systems, particularly in an ascetic context, held that by renouncing the world, you became a direct target for demonic forces who sought to tempt you back to sin or break your faith. Your isolation. Remember that extreme isolation from Section 1 meant you had no one to share these struggles with. Amplifying their terrifying power, you were not just a holy person, you were a frontline soldier in a cosmic battle. With your own soul as the prize, it's like being a modern-day psychological thriller protagonist, but your villain is literal demons, and your therapy is just more isolation and suffering. The most insidious form of this warfare came in the form of temptations. These weren't always grand, obvious evils. They could be vivid, alluring memories of past comforts. Delicious foods remember that scant diet from Section 3, or human companionship. They could be whispers of doubt, urging you to question the validity of your path, or surges of pride, tempting you to believe your piety was superior to others. Imagine the agonizing struggle against the vivid memory of a warm loaf of bread, the seductive allure of a beautiful face, or the insidious thought that your suffering was meaningless. Knowing that to succumb, even in thought, was a spiritual defeat, more terrifying, and often a consequence of extreme deprivation and isolation, were overt demonic visions. The human mind, under duress, can create incredibly vivid hallucinations. For hermits, these often took the form of terrifying, grotesque demons that would taunt, threaten, or even physically assault them in their perception. These weren't just abstract ideas. They were believed to be real, tangible encounters. Imagine waking in the dead of night to the terrifying sight of a horned beast looming over you, its eyes glowing, its voice hissing blasphemies, or feeling cold, unseen hands grasping at you in the darkness. It's enough to make you wish for a simple life as a villager, or perhaps just a very strong medieval exorcist on retainer. This constant spiritual warfare highlights the intense psychological and theological struggles inherent in the hermit's life, demonstrating how their self-imposed suffering was often intertwined with a terrifying inner landscape where the boundaries between reality, hallucination, and genuine spiritual experience became profoundly blurred, making their mental torment as real as any physical ailment. One mainstream historical fact that powerfully illustrates this phenomenon is the extensive literature of medieval hagiographies, particularly those detailing the lives of desert hermits like Saint Anthony, which are replete with detailed accounts of their struggles against demonic temptations and vivid, often terrifying, visions of devils, widely interpreted as reflecting the psychological impact of their ascetic lives. A particularly quirky or fringe tidbit is that some medieval hermits, particularly those tormented by persistent demonic visions, would reportedly draw crude symbols or crosses in the dirt or on their cave walls, or even physically throw small stones at the places where they perceived the demons to be, believing these actions had a patropaic power to ward off the malevolent spirits. Imagine flinging a pebble at an invisible demon to make it go away. It certainly highlights their desperate attempts to engage with and combat their inner or outer. From their perspective, tormentors, historians still argue whether the accounts of demonic visions experienced by medieval hermits primarily represented genuine supernatural encounters and a literal spiritual battlefield, validating their ascetic path, or if they were largely psychological manifestations, exacerbated by malnutrition, sleep deprivation, and extreme isolation, reflecting the limits of human endurance. Did they battle real demons? Or just their own minds regardless? Your medieval life as a hermit was an unending campaign of spiritual warfare, plagued by relentless temptations and terrifying demonic visions. So, your medieval life as a hermit was an unending campaign of spiritual warfare, plagued by relentless temptations and terrifying demonic visions. But even if you somehow managed to keep your inner demons at bay, the physical dangers of your chosen wilderness were very real and very much external wild encounters beasts, bandits, real danger. Forget idyllic nature scenes and peaceful contemplation in your isolated retreat. Every rustle in the bushes or distant sound of human voices could herald a terrifying confrontation, making your precarious existence a constant dance with very tangible threats. Imagine the sudden, spine-chilling snarl of a wolf just outside your cave, the unexpected gleam of a bandit's blade in the shadows, or the heart-stopping moment you realized you were not alone in your secluded glen. This was the omnipresent reality of wild encounters. By choosing to live apart from established settlements, you implicitly chose to live in the untamed fringes of the medieval world, a place where the rule of law was weak and the forces of nature were supreme. You were not just a holy person, you were a vulnerable squatter in a dangerous land, constantly on guard against threats that could end your life in an instant. It's like being a modern-day wilderness photographer, but your subjects are often hostile, and your camera is basically a prayer, the most common and perhaps most terrifying. Encounters were with beasts. Medieval Europe was still home to large predators like wolves, bears, and wild boars. Your meager shelter, remember that primitive shelter from Section 2 offered little protection, and your solitary nature made you an easy target. A hungry wolf pack, a protective sow, or a territorial bear could pose an existential threat. Imagine waking to the sound of heavy breathing just outside your dwelling, seeing the glint of eyes in the darkness, or having to desperately fend off a snarling creature with only a stick or a rock, knowing that one wrong move could lead to a bloody end. Beyond the animal kingdom, there was the human element: bandits. Isolated roads and wild forests were the hunting grounds for outlaws, deserters, and desperate vagrants. A hermit's remote location, though chosen for spiritual reasons, also made them vulnerable targets. While hermits typically had no wealth, they might possess meager food supplies, remember that scant diet from Section 3, or simply be a convenient victim for practice or cruelty. Imagine the terrifying approach of rough, unfamiliar men, their faces obscured by shadows, their intentions unknown. Knowing that your life could be taken for nothing more than the tattered robes on your back or the few crusts of bread you possessed, it's enough to make you wish for a simple life as a pampered noble, or perhaps just a very reliable medieval security system. This constant threat from real danger highlights the grim realities of living outside the protective structures of medieval society, demonstrating that the hermit's spiritual quest was often intertwined with a very physical battle for survival against both nature's predators and humanity's darker elements, making their life a precarious balance between piety and peril. One mainstream historical fact that powerfully illustrates these dangers is the numerous medieval chronicles and legal documents that recount instances of wolf attacks on isolated individuals, and the persistent problem of banditry and outlaws in forested and remote regions, confirming that such threats were common and very real concerns for anyone living outside secure settlements. A particularly quirky or fringe tidbit is that some medieval hermits, particularly those who regularly encountered aggressive wild animals, would reportedly carry small, intricately carved wooden crosses or bone amulets, not just for spiritual protection, but believing these charms had a specific power to calm agitated beasts or blind bandits to their presence. Imagine carrying a lucky twig to ward off a bear attack. It certainly highlights their blend of genuine danger and their superstitious attempts to control it. Historians still argue whether the accounts of hermits miraculously taming wild animals or escaping bandit attacks primarily served as hagiographical embellishments, designed to highlight the hermit's sanctity and divine favor, or if they sometimes reflected genuine instances of human-animal interaction based on familiarity with local wildlife, or strategic evasion of human threats through cunning and knowledge of the terrain. Did it prove their holiness, or just their cleverness? Regardless, your medieval life as a hermit was a constant confrontation with wild encounters, facing perilous beasts and dangerous bandits, an unending source of real danger. So, your medieval life as a hermit was a constant confrontation with wild encounters, facing perilous beasts and dangerous bandits, an unending source of real danger, but amidst all the external and internal torments. The core purpose of your existence was meant to be one of profound spiritual focus. Yet even this was often twisted into another form of misery: constant prayer, repetitive ritual, mental fatigue. Forget spontaneous devotion and joyful contemplation in your chosen solitude. Prayer often became a relentless, almost mechanical obligation, making your spiritual solace ironically transform into a source of monotonous exhaustion. Imagine the endless repetition of the same Latin phrases, the aching knees from hours spent prostrate on cold ground, and the battle to keep your mind from wandering during yet another recitation. This was the omnipresent reality of your constant prayer. For hermits, prayer was not a casual activity. It was the bedrock of their daily existence, their primary means of communicating with God, seeking forgiveness, and advancing spiritually. Monastic rules and the examples of revered saints often prescribed specific, lengthy periods of prayer throughout the day and night. You were not just a holy person, you were a human prayer mill, attempting to achieve spiritual transcendence through sheer, unceasing repetition. It's like being a modern-day call center agent, but your calls are to God. They're 24/7 and there's no coffee break. The most challenging aspect was the repetitive ritual. Many prayers involved reciting psalms, specific litanies, or the Paternoster Our Father countless times. While this repetition was meant to foster focus and spiritual absorption, in practice, it could easily become rote, a mechanical exercise divorced from genuine contemplation. Imagine trying to maintain profound spiritual feeling through the 100th repetition of the same prayer. Feeling your mind drift to thoughts of hunger. Remember that scant diet from Section 3 or the chill in your bones. Remember that primitive shelter from Section 2. And then chastising yourself for your lack of focus, only to resume the endless cycle. This relentless repetition and the sheer volume of prayer inevitably led to profound mental fatigue. Your mind, already strained by isolation, remember that extreme isolation from Section 1 and deprivation, would struggle to remain engaged. Sleep deprivation, especially for those who prayed through the night, would exacerbate this. Imagine the heavy eyelids, the desperate struggle to keep your thoughts from dissolving into a hazy stupor, and the creeping despair that your spiritual efforts were becoming empty gestures, devoid of true meaning. It's enough to make you wish for a simple life as a jester, or perhaps just a very engaging medieval podcast to break up the monotony. This practice of constant prayer highlights the paradoxical nature of the hermit's spiritual discipline, demonstrating how a noble pursuit of divine connection could, through extreme and repetitive practice, transform into a grueling and mentally exhausting obligation, turning spiritual solace into a form of suffering. One mainstream historical fact that powerfully illustrates this relentless prayer is the structure of medieval monastic hours, canonical hours, which prescribed specific, numerous times throughout the day and night for prayer and psalmody, a structure often adopted or adapted by hermits, indicating a life dominated by fixed prayer cycles. A particularly quirky or fringe tidbit is that some medieval hermits, particularly those struggling with the monotony of constant prayer, would reportedly use small, rough-hewn wooden beads or knotted ropes, a very early form of a rosary, not just for counting prayers, but as a tactile anchor to prevent their minds from wandering. Feeling the knot or bead as a reminder to refocus. Imagine clutching a string of pebbles just to stay on track during your spiritual marathon. It certainly highlights their practical attempts to maintain discipline in the face of mental exhaustion. Historians still argue whether the extreme regimen of constant prayer among medieval hermits primarily led to genuine mystical experiences and a deeper connection with the divine, as the mind transcended earthly distractions through repetition, or if it more frequently resulted in psychological burnout, spiritual emptiness, and even cognitive impairment. Due to the intense mental and physical strain, did it bring enlightenment or just exhaustion? Regardless, your medieval life as a hermit was often defined by constant prayer, a relentless repetitive ritual leading to profound mental fatigue. So, your medieval life as a hermit was often defined by constant prayer, a relentless repetitive ritual leading to profound mental fatigue. But despite your self-imposed spiritual separation from the world, you couldn't completely escape its practicalities. Sometimes, even a hermit had to lower themselves to the indignity of seeking help, begging for alms humiliation. Dependence. Forget self-sufficiency and quiet dignity in your chosen life of poverty. The harsh reality often meant relying on the fickle charity of others, making every outstretched hand a symbol of your vulnerable and often shameful reliance. Imagine the discomfort of approaching a bustling village, your ragged appearance drawing stares, and the quiet plea for a crust of bread or a discarded tunic. Knowing your survival hung on the generosity of strangers, this was the omnipresent reality of begging for alms. While some hermits received patronage from wealthy benefactors or were supported by nearby monasteries, many were truly reliant on sporadic acts of charity from local villagers, pilgrims, or travelers. Your vow of poverty meant you possessed nothing, and your isolation, remember that extreme isolation from Section 1 meant you had no steady means of support. You were not just a holy person, you were a perpetual supplicant, forced to humble yourself for the basic necessities of life. It's like being a modern-day street performer, but your performance is simply your existence, and your payment is often just pity. The act itself often carried a profound sense of humiliation. You, who sought to transcend worldly concerns, were forced to acknowledge your fundamental physical needs and your dependence on the very society you had renounced. Your gaunt appearance, remember that scant diet from Section 3 and unkempt state, remember that lack of hygiene from Section 5 might elicit pity, but also sometimes suspicion or disdain. Imagine the averted gazes, the hurried dismissal, or the occasional whispered insult as you stood at the edge of a market, feeling the profound shame of your desperate need, knowing that your spiritual pride clashed directly with your physical vulnerability. This constant need meant a state of perpetual dependence. You couldn't choose your food, you took what was given. You couldn't demand specific items, and you had no guarantee of sustenance from one day to the next. Your very existence was a fluctuating tide, rising and falling with the charitable impulses of those around you. Imagine the gnawing anxiety of an empty bowl, the uncertainty of your next meal, and the realization that your spiritual freedom was paradoxically tied to the willingness of others to offer you their scraps. It's enough to make you wish for a simple life as a self-sufficient farmer, or perhaps just a very reliable medieval welfare system. This necessity of begging for alms highlights the profound vulnerability and the often uncomfortable practicalities of the hermit's life, demonstrating that even the most devout ascetic could not entirely escape the material demands of existence. Forcing a constant, often humiliating, reliance on the outside world they had sought to abandon. One mainstream historical fact that powerfully illustrates this dependence is the numerous medieval texts, including saints' lives and monastic rules, that detail the practice of mendicancy, begging among hermits and mendicant orders, often portraying it as a virtue of humility and detachment from worldly possessions, but inherently acknowledging its necessity for survival. A particularly quirky or fringe tidbit is that some medieval hermits, in an attempt to maintain a degree of spiritual dignity while begging, would reportedly stand completely silent, holding out an empty bowl with their eyes fixed heavenward, believing that their very posture of silent humility would be more persuasive to charitable souls than any spoken plea. Imagine a completely silent, unmoving figure, just holding out a bowl. It certainly highlights their unique methods of navigating a profoundly uncomfortable necessity. Historians still argue whether the practice of begging for alms among medieval hermits primarily served as a genuine exercise in humility and a demonstration of complete trust in divine providence, reinforcing their spiritual ideals, or if it was simply a pragmatic response to their self-imposed poverty and lack of resources, making it a necessary evil rather than a desired spiritual practice. Did it show profound faith or just practical need? Regardless, your medieval life as a hermit often involved the uncomfortable reality of begging for alms, enduring deep humiliation, and living in constant dependence. So, your medieval life as a hermit often involved the uncomfortable reality of begging for alms, enduring deep humiliation, and living in constant dependence. But even if charity was forthcoming, and your meager sustenance secured, another terrifying reality of your isolated existence was the complete and utter absence of help when your body inevitably failed you. Medical neglect, illness, injury, no cures. Forget doctors, medicine, or even basic first aid in your chosen wilderness retreat. Every ache, every cut, and every fever was a solitary battle, often fought to its bitter and agonizing end. Imagine the searing pain of an infected wound, the relentless grip of a fever that left you weak and delirious, or the terrifying helplessness of a broken bone, knowing there was absolutely no one to turn to for relief. This was the omnipresent reality of medical neglect. By deliberately removing yourself from society, you also removed yourself from any semblance of medieval medical care. Rudimentary as it was, there were no apothecaries, no barber surgeons, no monastic infirmaries at your beck and call. Your body was your own, to suffer and heal or not on its own terms. You were not just a holy person. You were a solo patient in a vast, indifferent wilderness, with your own fortitude and perhaps a prayer as your only remedies. It's like being a modern-day wilderness survivalist, but your first aid kit is just some moss and a strong belief, and your rescue team is non-existent. The consequences were dire for both illness and injury. A simple cold could easily escalate into life-threatening pneumonia. Remember that damp, primitive shelter from Section 2. A minor cut from foraging for food could fester into a deadly infection. Remember that lack of hygiene from Section 5. A fall on rough terrain could result in a broken limb, leaving you immobile and utterly vulnerable. Remember those wild animals from Section 8. Imagine the chilling sweat of a high fever, the racking cough that left your lungs burning, or the throbbing agony of a sprained ankle, forcing you to crawl rather than walk. All endured in agonizing solitude. And critically, there were no cures. Medieval medicine, even in the best urban settings, was often based on a blend of herbal remedies, superstitious practices, and rudimentary surgical techniques that were themselves dangerous. For a hermit, even these limited options were completely unavailable. You couldn't send for a physician, you had no access to healing herbs unless you knew them yourself. And they were locally available, and certainly no one to set a broken bone. You relied solely on your body's natural resilience. Often weakened by a scant diet, remember that malnutrition from Section 3. And your faith. It's enough to make you wish for a simple life as a leper in a well-funded medieval hospital. Or perhaps just a very reliable medieval self-healing potion. This pervasive medical neglect highlights the profound physical vulnerability and sheer hardship of the hermit's life, demonstrating that their spiritual quest was intertwined with an almost unimaginable degree of physical suffering and a constant, terrifying proximity to illness, injury, and agonizing death without aid. One mainstream historical fact that powerfully illustrates this vulnerability is the high mortality rates and prevalence of disease evident in skeletal remains from medieval populations, even those with access to basic medical care, indicating that individuals like hermits living in isolation would have faced even greater health risk without any form of intervention or support. A particularly quirky or fringe tidbit is that some medieval hermits, particularly those suffering from chronic pain or lingering illness, would reportedly engage in sympathetic magic or folk healing, such as tracing the outline of their pain on the ground with a stick and then burying the stick. Believing this would transfer the ailment to the earth? Imagine trying to get rid of your fever by drawing a little fever ghost in the dirt. It certainly highlights their desperate and often imaginative attempts to find relief in the absence of real medicine. Historians still argue whether the complete lack of medical care endured by medieval hermits primarily accelerated their physical decline and led to shorter, more painful lives, highlighting the brutal consequences of their isolation, or if their rigorous asceticism and perceived divine favor sometimes resulted in remarkable feats of resilience and survival. Confounding the norms of medieval health and mortality, did it kill them faster? Or make them miraculously tough? Regardless, your medieval life as a hermit meant contending with profound medical neglect, suffering through relentless illness and debilitating injury with absolutely no cures. So, your medieval life as a hermit meant contending with profound medical neglect, suffering through relentless illness and debilitating injury, with absolutely no cures. But even if your major ailments somehow held off, your isolated dwelling was perpetually teeming with smaller, yet ceaselessly annoying, inhabitants vermin infestation rodents, insects, constant nuisance. Forget pristine living spaces and pest control in your humble abode. You shared your meager existence with an army of uninvited, scuttling and biting companions, making true peace and comfort an utterly elusive dream. Imagine the scratching sounds of tiny claws scurrying through your thatch roof, the incessant buzzing of flies around your face, and the infuriating itch of countless flea bites. This was the omnipresent reality of vermin infestation. Your primitive shelter, remember that from Section 2. Often damp, remember that damp from Section 2 and filled with decaying organic matter from foraging and sparse living. Remember that scant diet from Section 3 was a perfect breeding ground for all manner of unwelcome creatures. You couldn't escape them. They were simply part of the package deal when you renounced worldly comforts. You were not just a holy person. You were a reluctant landlord to a bustling ecosystem of pests, constantly plagued by their unwelcome presence. It's like being a modern-day urban gardener, but your garden is your bed, and your crop is fleas and lice. And you can't use pesticides. The most common invaders were rodents. Mice and rats would be constant companions, seeking warmth, shelter, and any crumbs of food you might accidentally leave behind. They would gnaw at your meager belongings, disturb your sleep, and potentially carry diseases a thought you couldn't fully comprehend. But their presence was miserable nonetheless. Imagine waking to the sound of gnawing in the dark, the unnerving feeling of something scurrying over your feet, and the constant frustration of trying to protect your precious, limited food supply from their ceaseless depredations, equally pervasive, especially in warmer months, where flies would swarm around your face, particularly if you had a fire going or if you lived near any source of moisture. Fleas and lice, remember that lack of hygiene from Section 5, were a constant, tormenting presence, living in your hair, clothing, and bedding, causing relentless itching and discomfort. Ticks and other biting insects from the surrounding wilderness were also a threat. Imagine the maddening buzz of a fly around your ear during deep meditation, the endless, almost unconscious scratching that became second nature, and the sight of small, crawling creatures in your hair or on your skin, a never-ending source of irritation. This perpetual constant nuisance was not just an inconvenience, it added an immense layer of low-grade suffering to your daily life. It robbed you of restful sleep, made concentration difficult, and served as a constant reminder of the physical degradation you embraced. There was no easy escape, no medieval exterminator to call. You simply endured their presence as another form of penance. It's enough to make you wish for a simple life as a knight with a clean, pest-free castle, or perhaps just a very effective medieval bug zapper. This pervasive vermin infestation highlights the gritty, inescapable realities of medieval life, especially for those living in austere, isolated conditions, demonstrating how even the pursuit of spiritual purity could not exempt one from the most basic, yet deeply irritating, struggles against the natural world's smallest inhabitants. One mainstream historical fact that powerfully illustrates this problem is the archaeological evidence from medieval dwellings, including monastic cells and rural huts, that often reveals significant remains of rodent skeletons and insect exoskeletons, consistent with high levels of infestation in these environments. Confirming vermin were a ubiquitous part of medieval life, a particularly quirky or fringe tidbit is that some medieval hermits, particularly those who embraced extreme humility, would reportedly refuse to kill any vermin found in their hermitage, believing that even these creatures were part of God's creation, and enduring their bites was another form of spiritual discipline or even a reminder of their own insignificance. Imagine letting mice run freely and enduring flea bites as an act of piety. It certainly highlights their radical interpretation of asceticism. Historians still argue whether the constant presence of vermin for medieval hermits primarily contributed to a higher incidence of disease transmission and physical discomfort, posing a real health threat, or if their spiritual interpretation of these nuisances as a form of humble penance helped them mentally cope with what would otherwise be intolerable living conditions. Turning misery into meaning, did it make them sicker, or just more devout regardless? Your medieval life as a hermit was defined by persistent vermin infestation, a constant battle against rodents and insects, making your existence a perpetual, constant nuisance. So, your medieval life as a hermit was defined by persistent vermin infestation, a constant battle against rodents and insects, making your existence a perpetual, constant nuisance, but even more insidious than physical discomfort or external threats. The deepest misery often stemmed from the very place you sought solace your own mind, slowly eroding under the relentless pressure, mental deterioration delusions, despair, madness. Forget clarity and enlightenment in your profound solitude. The lack of stimulation and human interaction often warped perception, making your inner world a terrifying landscape of distorted thoughts and spiraling hopelessness. Imagine the unsettling certainty of illogical thoughts, the creeping apathy that dulled all sensation, or the terrifying conviction that unseen forces were manipulating your every move. This was the omnipresent reality of mental deterioration. Your extreme isolation. Remember that extreme isolation from Section 1. Combined with malnutrition, remember that scant diet from Section 3. Sleep deprivation from constant prayer, perhaps, and ceaseless physical suffering, created a perfect storm for psychological breakdown. The very act of cutting yourself off from the world, intended for spiritual growth, paradoxically put your mental stability at grave risk. You were not just a holy person, you were a fragile human psyche pushed to its absolute breaking point, your mind turning inward with devastating consequences. It's like being a modern-day extreme method actor. But your role is a mad saint, and your performance is your actual unraveling. One of the most terrifying symptoms was the onset of delusions. Without external reality checks, your internal thoughts could become profoundly distorted. You might develop fixed, false beliefs about your spiritual status, divine messages, or the intentions of unseen entities. These could range from grandiosity, believing you were a saint or prophet, to paranoia, believing you were constantly persecuted by demons or malevolent spirits. Beyond just the usual spiritual warfare from Section 7, imagine the chilling conviction that God was speaking directly to you through the rustling leaves, or the terrifying certainty that shadowy figures were always watching, their presence making every moment a test of your eroding sanity. This could easily slide into profound despair. The relentless hardship, the lack of progress, and the sheer monotony of your existence could crush your spirit. the initial fervor that drove you to asceticism might wane, leaving behind only an aching emptiness. Thoughts of failure, unworthiness, and utter hopelessness would plague your mind. Imagine the heavy weight of apathy, the inability to find joy in anything, and the creeping thought that your suffering was utterly meaningless. A terrifying realization that could lead to complete mental paralysis or even suicidal ideation in its most extreme form. This deterioration manifested as outright madness. Hermits could become completely disconnected from reality, exhibiting erratic behavior, speaking in tongues, or engaging in bizarre rituals beyond just self-flagellation. Their spiritual quest could easily transmute into a tragic descent into severe mental illness. Unrecognized and untreated, remember medical neglect. It's enough to make you wish for a simple life as a sane peasant. Or perhaps just a very effective medieval mental health institution if such a thing even existed. This profound mental deterioration highlights the inherent dangers of extreme asceticism and isolation on the human mind, demonstrating that the pursuit of spiritual purity, when pushed to its limits, could tragically lead to a shattering of the self, turning a quest for enlightenment into a devastating journey into madness. One mainstream historical fact that powerfully illustrates this psychological toll is the accounts of holy fools, or individuals exhibiting erratic and non-normative behaviors within medieval religious contexts, sometimes interpreted as signs of extreme piety, but often displaying symptoms consistent with severe psychological distress or mental illness arising from their austere lifestyles. A particularly quirky or fringe tidbit is that some medieval hermits, particularly those experiencing vivid auditory hallucinations, would reportedly attempt to communicate back with the voices they heard, sometimes even having lengthy, one-sided conversations with invisible beings, believing they were conversing with angels, demons, or even God directly. Imagine arguing with an invisible voice for hours on end in your cave. It certainly highlights the profound impact of isolation on perception and the desperate human need for interaction. Even if imagined, historians still argue whether the mental deterioration observed in some medieval hermits primarily represented genuine spiritual trials in a struggle against demonic influence, a test of their faith, or if it was more a direct physiological and psychological consequence of their extreme living conditions, leading to psychosis and other forms of mental illness. Did it refine their souls, or just break their brains? Regardless, your medieval life as a hermit brought you face to face with profound mental deterioration, haunted by disturbing delusions, crippling despair, and the terrifying specter of madness. So, your medieval life as a hermit brought you face to face with profound mental deterioration, haunted by disturbing delusions, crippling despair, and the terrifying specter of madness. But even if your sanity held a tenuous grip, your prolonged removal from human society created a more subtle, yet equally debilitating, impairment loss of social skills, awkwardness, communication breakdown. Forget fluid conversations and easy rapport. In your profound solitude, the very faculties that enable human connection slowly atrophied, making any return to society, however brief, a source of intense discomfort and misunderstanding. Imagine the stumbling attempts to form coherent sentences after weeks of silence, the blank stares you might receive when trying to articulate complex thoughts, or the crushing feeling of being utterly out of sync with the rhythms of human interaction. This was the omnipresent reality of your loss of social skills. Human beings are fundamentally social creatures, and prolonged deprivation of interaction leads to a decline in the very abilities that facilitate it. Your extreme isolation, remember that from Section 1 meant that the muscles of social engagement, verbal fluency, nonverbal cues, empathy, and conversational rhythm simply withered from disuse. You were not just a holy person, you were a social ghost, a former human in a world where you no longer spoke the common tongue of connection. It's like being a modern-day deep space astronaut returning after decades. But your re-entry is into a bustling medieval market, and your social gravity is completely gone. This manifested as profound awkwardness. When you did encounter another person, perhaps a pilgrim seeking spiritual advice or a villager offering alms, remember begging for alms. The interaction would feel strange, strained, and profoundly unnatural. You might struggle with eye contact, find yourself unable to interpret subtle facial expressions, or respond in ways that seemed strange or inappropriate to others. Imagine the fumbling for words, the sudden silences that stretched uncomfortably, and the sensation of being utterly clumsy in the delicate dance of human conversation. Your mind unable to keep pace with the nuances of social exchange. More severely, this led to a communication breakdown. Your vocabulary might shrink, your sentence structure become simplistic, and your ability to engage in reciprocal dialogue diminish significantly. The rich tapestry of human conversation, with its jokes, its empathy, its shared understandings, would be lost to you. You might speak only in short, direct phrases or resort to gestures. Imagine trying to explain a complex spiritual vision, perhaps a delusion from Section 13 to a bewildered villager. Finding your words inadequate, your meaning lost, and the gulf between your inner world and their understanding growing wider with every failed attempt. It's enough to make you wish for a simple life as a silent forest animal, or perhaps just a very patient medieval speech therapist. This loss of social skills highlights the profound, yet often unacknowledged, toll of extreme isolation on human psychology, demonstrating that the hermit's spiritual quest, while pursuing detachment from worldly concerns, paradoxically crippled their most fundamental human capacity, the ability to connect and communicate with their fellow beings, making their misery not just physical or mental, but profoundly social. One mainstream historical fact that powerfully illustrates this phenomenon is the accounts from medieval chroniclers and travelers who sometimes described hermits, even revered ones, as being unkempt, speaking haltingly, or having unusual mannerisms, which could be interpreted as signs of social withdrawal and the erosion of conventional social graces due to prolonged isolation. A particularly quirky or fringe tidbit is that some medieval hermits, particularly those who struggled severely with verbal communication, would reportedly develop a highly personalized system of nonverbal signals or gestures, almost a private language, to communicate simple needs or express gratitude to the few individuals they encountered, which would be entirely incomprehensible to anyone else. Imagine trying to communicate a deep spiritual truth with just hand gestures and grunts. It certainly highlights their desperate attempts to bridge the communication gap created by their solitude. Historians still argue whether the loss of social skills among medieval hermits primarily reflected a deliberate and spiritually virtuous shedding of worldly communication, allowing for a deeper internal dialogue with God, or if it was simply an unavoidable and debilitating consequence of prolonged sensory and social deprivation. Leading to cognitive and behavioral regression, did it show deeper piety, or just cognitive decline regardless? Your medieval life as a hermit brought with it a profound loss of social skills, leading to debilitating awkwardness and a tragic communication breakdown. So, your medieval life as a hermit brought with it a profound loss of social skills, leading to debilitating awkwardness and a tragic communication breakdown. But perhaps the most insidious and ultimately soul-crushing misery of your ascetic existence was the constant internal battle against doubt. The gnawing suspicion that all your suffering might be in vain, purpose ambiguity doubt, spiritual emptiness. Forget unwavering faith and divine certainty in your profound solitude. Stripped of worldly comforts and human validation, the very reason for your extreme sacrifice could become hazy, making your painful journey a torment of existential questioning. Imagine the chilling whisper in your mind asking, "Is this truly God's will? Am I achieving anything?" The creeping sensation of spiritual barrenness despite all your efforts, or the terrifying thought that your immense suffering was utterly meaningless. This was the omnipresent reality of your purpose ambiguity. You had embraced an exceptionally harsh life. Enduring extreme isolation, remember that from Section 1. A scant diet, remember that from Section 3. And relentless physical torment, remember self-flagellation and medical neglect. All of this was undertaken for a singular, monumental purpose, spiritual purity, and a closer connection to God, but without external validation, without clear signs or miracles. And with your mind often deteriorating, remember mental deterioration. The very meaning of your sacrifice could become profoundly unclear. You were not just a holy person. You were a perpetual seeker, constantly striving for a meaning that felt perpetually out of reach. Battling an existential crisis in the most extreme conditions. It's like being a modern-day extreme athlete, but you're running a marathon to nowhere, and you're not even sure if the finish line exists. The most persistent torment was doubt. You would question your own worthiness, the effectiveness of your penance, and even the existence or benevolence of the divine. Every hardship, every pain, every temptation, remember those from spiritual warfare that wasn't immediately followed by a spiritual revelation, could fuel this insidious doubt. Imagine the desperate prayers that felt like they were bouncing off a cold, indifferent sky, the agonizing reevaluation of every vision or feeling, wondering if it was truly divine or just a product of your starved, exhausted mind. This wasn't merely a fleeting thought, it was a deep-seated, corrosive uncertainty that could undermine your entire reason for being. This could lead to a profound sense of spiritual emptiness. Despite all the hours of constant prayer, remember that from Section 9. Despite all the self-denial, you might feel no closer to God, no sense of inner peace, no spiritual fulfillment. The promised spiritual rewards seemed elusive, leaving a void where meaning should have been. Imagine the profound disappointment of waking after a night of intense suffering, feeling no closer to salvation, no sense of divine presence, and the chilling realization that all your efforts were leading to a void, a spiritual dead end. It's enough to make you wish for a simple life of hedonism, or perhaps just a very clear and unambiguous divine sign. This gnawing purpose ambiguity highlights the ultimate psychological and existential burden of the hermit's life, demonstrating that even in the most devout and self-sacrificing individuals, the absence of clear validation and the relentless grind of suffering could lead to the most profound misery of all, the terrifying loss of meaning and the crushing weight of existential uncertainty, making their spiritual journey a deeply personal and often tragically unfulfilled struggle. One mainstream historical fact that powerfully illustrates this internal struggle is the numerous spiritual treatises and confessional writings from medieval mystics and ascetics, which frequently describe periods of profound spiritual darkness, dryness, or intense doubt, even among the most revered figures, indicating that such existential struggles were a common, if painful, part of the ascetic path. A particularly quirky or fringe tidbit is that some medieval hermits, particularly those grappling with deep spiritual emptiness, would reportedly develop a unique, almost obsessive focus on collecting a specific type of unusually shaped stone or a particular kind of wildflower, believing that finding the perfect specimen was a hidden divine message or a small tangible sign of God's continuing presence in their otherwise barren spiritual landscape. Imagine pouring all your existential hope into finding just the right pebble. It certainly highlights their desperate attempts to find meaning in extreme desolation. Historians still argue whether the experience of purpose ambiguity and spiritual emptiness among medieval hermits primarily represented a necessary dark night of the soul, a period of spiritual purification and growth that ultimately led to deeper faith, or if it more often signaled a tragic and unresolvable crisis of meaning, leading to profound psychological and spiritual breakdown in the absence of external support and clear validation? Did it lead to growth? or just collapse regardless. Your medieval life as a hermit was an unending battle against purpose ambiguity, plagued by persistent doubt and haunted by a chilling spiritual emptiness. Now, let the chill of the cave fade, the gnawing hunger subside, and the whispers of doubt quieten. No more worrying about wild beasts, no more fear of illness without cure, and certainly no more agonizing over the meaning of your suffering. You can let go of the extreme isolation, the constant dirt, and the profound mental and physical torments of the medieval hermit. Their unwavering conviction, however harsh their path, was a testament to a different era, but their lives were undeniably miserable. That quiet, desperate, and often tragically misunderstood ancient world belongs to history, not to your peaceful present. Drift now into a deep, untroubled rest. Sweet dreams. End of script. Sweet dreams.